On the contrary, there are persons in whom the retention at night of the knowledge that they are sleeping and dreaming becomes quite manifest, and who are thus apparently endowed with the conscious faculty of guiding their dream life. Such a dreamer, for example, is dissatisfied with a turn taken by a dream. He breaks it off without waking and begins it afresh in order to continue it along different lines, just like a popular author who, upon request, gives a happier ending to his play. Or on another occasion, where the dream places him in a sexually exciting situation, he thinks in his sleep, "I don't want to continue this dream and exhaust myself by an emission. I would rather save it for a real situation." The Marquis Hervé Bachide declared that he had gained such power over his dreams that he could accelerate their course at will and turn them in any direction he wished. It seems that in him the wish to sleep had accorded a place to another, a preconscious wish, the wish to observe his dreams and to derive pleasure from them. Sleep is just as compatible with such a wish, resolve, as it is with some proviso as a condition of waking up. Wet nurses sleep. We know, too, that in all persons an interest in dreams greatly increases the number of dreams remembered after waking. Concerning other observations as to the guidance of dreams, Ferenczi states, "The dream takes the thought that happens to occupy our psychic life at the moment, and elaborates it from all sides. It lets any given dream picture drop when there is a danger that the wish fulfillment will miscarry, and attempts a new kind of solution, until it finally succeeds in creating a wish fulfillment that satisfies in one compromise both instances of the psychic life." End of section 43. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto, Birmingham, Alabama. Section 44 of the Interpretation of Dreams. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto. The Interpretation of Dreams by Sigmund Freud. Translated by A. Brill. Section 44. Waking caused by dreams. The function of dreams. The anxiety dream. Now that we know that throughout the night the preconscious is oriented to the wish to sleep, we can follow the dream process with proper understanding. But let us first summarize what we already know about this process. We have seen that day residues are left over from the waking activity of the mind, residues from which it has not been possible to withdraw all cathexis. Either one of the unconscious wishes has been aroused through the waking activity during the day, or it so happens that the two coincide. We have already discussed the multifarious possibilities. Either already during the day or only on the establishment of the state of sleep, the unconscious wish has made its way to the day residues and has effected a transference to them. Thus there arises a wish transferred to recent material, or the suppressed recent wish is revived by a reinforcement from the unconscious. This wish now endeavors to make its way to consciousness along the normal path of the thought processes, through the preconscious, to which indeed it belongs by virtue of one of its constituent elements. It is, however, confronted by the censorship which still subsists, and to whose influence it soon succumbs. It now takes on the distortion for which the way has already been paved by the transference to recent material. So far it is on the way to becoming something resembling an obsession, a delusion, or the like. That is, a thought reinforced by a transference and distorted in expression owing to the censorship. But its further progress is now checked by the state of sleep of the preconscious. This system has presumably protected itself against invasion by diminishing its excitations. The dream process, therefore, takes the regressive course, which is just opened up by the peculiarity of the sleeping state, and in doing so follows the attraction exerted on it by memory groups, which are, in part only, themselves present as visual cathexis, not as translations into the symbols of the later systems. On its way to regression, it acquires representability. The subject of compression will be discussed later. The dream process has by this time covered the second part of its contorted course. The first part threads its way progressively from the unconscious scenes or fantasies to the preconscious, while the second part struggles back from the boundary of the censorship to the tract of the perceptions. But when the dream process becomes a perception content, it has, so to speak, eluded the obstacles set up in the PCs by the censorship and the sleeping state. It succeeds in drawing attention to itself, and in being remarked by consciousness. For consciousness, which for us means a sense organ for the apprehension of psychic qualities, can be excited in waking life from two sources. Firstly, from the periphery of the whole apparatus, the perceptive system, and secondly, from the excitations of pleasure and pain, which emerge as the sole psychic qualities yielded by the transpositions of energy in the interior of the apparatus. All other processes in the psi systems, even those in the preconscious, are devoid of all psychic quality, and are therefore not objects of consciousness, inasmuch as they do not provide either pleasure or pain for its perception. We shall have to assume that these releases of pleasure and pain automatically regulate the course of the cathectic processes. But in order to make possible more delicate performances, it subsequently proved necessary to render the flow of ideas more independent of pain signals. To accomplish this, the PC system needed qualities of its own which could attract consciousness, and most probably received them through the connection of the preconscious processes with the memory system of speech symbols, which was not devoid of quality. Through the qualities of this system, consciousness, hitherto only a sense organ for perceptions, now becomes also a sense organ for a part of our thought processes. There are now, as it were, two sensory surfaces, one turned toward perception and the other toward the preconscious thought processes. I must assume that the sensory surface of consciousness which is turned to the preconscious is rendered far more unexcitable by sleep than the surface turned toward the P system. The giving up of interest in the nocturnal thought process is, of course, an appropriate procedure. Nothing is to happen in thought. The preconscious wants to sleep, but once the dream becomes perception, it is capable of exciting consciousness through the qualities now gained. The sensory excitation performs what is in fact its function, namely, it directs a part of the cathectic energy available in the PCs to the exciting cause in the form of attention. We must therefore admit that the dream always has a waking effect, that is, it calls into activity part of the quiescent energy of the PCs. Under the influence of this energy, it now undergoes the process which we have described as secondary elaboration with a view to coherence and comprehensibility. This means that the dream is treated by this energy like any other perception content. It is subjected to the same anticipatory ideas as far at least as the material allows. As far as this third part of the dream process has any direction, this is once more progressive. To avoid misunderstanding, it will not be amiss to say a few words as to the temporal characteristics of these dream processes. In a very interesting discussion, evidently suggested by Maury's puzzling guillotine dream, Goblet tries to demonstrate that a dream takes up no other time than the transition period between sleeping and waking. The process of waking up requires time. During this time, the dream occurs. It is supposed that the final picture of the dream is so vivid that it forces the dreamer to awake. In reality, it is so vivid only because when it appears the dreamer is already very near waking. Un rêve, c'est un réveil qui commence. A dream is the beginning of wakening. It has already been pointed out by Dugas that Goblet, in order to generalize his theory, was forced to ignore a great many facts. There are also dreams from which we do not awaken. For example, many dreams in which we dream that we dream. From our knowledge of the dream work, we can by no means admit that it extends only over the period of waking. On the contrary, we must consider it probable that the first part of the dream work is already begun during the day, when we are still under the domination of the preconscious. The second phase of the dream work, viz., the alteration by the censorship, the attraction exercised by unconscious scenes, and the penetration to perception, continues probably all through the night, and accordingly we may always be correct when we report a feeling that we have been dreaming all night, even although we cannot say what we have dreamed. I do not, however, think that it is necessary to assume that, up to the time of becoming conscious, the dream processes really follow the temporal sequence which we have described, viz., that there is first the transferred dream wish, then the process of distortion due to the censorship, and then the change of direction to regression, etc. We were obliged to construct such a sequence for the sake of description. In reality, however, it is probably rather a question of simultaneously trying this path and that, and of the excitation fluctuating to and fro, until finally, because it has attained the most apposite concentration, one particular grouping remains in the field. Certain personal experiences even incline me to believe that the dream work often requires more than one day and one night to produce its result, in which case the extraordinary art manifested in the construction of the dream is shorn of its miraculous character. In my opinion, even the regard for the comprehensibility of the dream as a perceptual event may exert its influence before the dream attracts consciousness to itself. From this point, however, the process is accelerated, since the dream is henceforth subjected to the same treatment as any other perception. It is like fireworks, which require hours for their preparation and then flare up in a moment. Through the dream work, the dream process now either gains sufficient intensity to attract consciousness to itself and to arouse the preconscious, quite independently of the time or profundity of sleep, or its intensity is insufficient, and it must wait in readiness until Action becomes more alert immediately before waking meets it halfway. More dreams seem to operate with relatively slight psychic intensities, for they wait for the process of waking. This then explains the fact that as a rule we perceive something dreamed if we are suddenly roused from a deep sleep. Here, as well as in spontaneous waking, our first glance lights upon the perception content created by the dream work, while the next falls on that provided by the outer world. But of greater theoretical interest are those dreams which are capable of waking us in the midst of our sleep. We may bear in mind the purposefulness which can be demonstrated in all other cases, and ask ourselves why the dream, that is, the unconscious wish, is granted the power to disturb our sleep, that is, the fulfillment of the preconscious wish. The explanation is probably to be found in certain relations of energy which we do not yet understand. If we did so, we should probably find that the freedom given to the dream and the expenditure upon it of a certain detached attention representing a saving of energy as against the alternative case of the unconscious having to be held in check at night just as it is during the day. As experience shows, dreaming, even if it interrupts our sleep several times a night, still remains compatible with sleep. We wake up for a moment and immediately fall asleep again. It is like driving off a fly in our sleep. We wake ad hoc. When we fall asleep again, we have removed the cause of disturbance. The familiar examples of the sleep of wet nurses, etc., show that the fulfillment of the wish to sleep is quite compatible with the maintenance of a certain amount of attention in a given direction. But we must here take note of an objection which is based on a greater knowledge of the unconscious processes. We have ourselves described the unconscious wishes as always active, whilst nevertheless asserting that in the daytime they are not strong enough to make themselves perceptible. But when the state of sleep supervenes, and the unconscious wish has shown its power to form a dream, and with it to awaken the preconscious, why does this power lapse after cognizance has been taken off the dream? Would it not seem more probable that the dream should continually renew itself, like the disturbing fly which, when driven away, takes pleasure in returning again and again? What justification have we for our assertion that the dream removes the disturbance to sleep? It is quite true that the unconscious wishes are always active. They represent paths which are always practicable, whether a quantum of excitation makes use of them. It is indeed an outstanding peculiarity of the unconscious processes that they are indestructible. Nothing can be brought to an end in the unconscious, nothing is past or forgotten. This is impressed upon us emphatically in the study of the neuroses, and especially of hysteria. The unconscious path of thought which leads to the discharge through an attack is forthwith possible again when there is a sufficient accumulation of excitation. The mortification suffered 30 years ago operates, after having gained access to the unconscious sources of affect during all these 30 years, as though it were a recent experience. Whenever its memory is touched, it revives and shows itself to be cathected with excitation, which procures a motor discharge for itself in an attack. It is precisely here that psychotherapy must intervene, its task being to ensure that the unconscious processes are settled and forgotten. Indeed, the fading of memories and the weak effect of impressions which are no longer recent, which we are apt to take as self-evident and to explain as a primary effect of our time on our psychic memory residues, are in reality secondary changes brought about by laborious work. It is the preconscious that accomplishes this work, and the only course which psychotherapy can pursue is to bring the uses under the dominion of the PCs. There are, therefore, two possible issues for any single unconscious excitation process. Either it is left to itself, in which case it ultimately breaks through somewhere and secures, on this one occasion, a discharge for its excitation into motility, or it succumbs to the influence of the preconscious, and through this its excitation becomes bound instead of being discharged. It is the latter case that occurs in the dream process. The cathexis from the PCs which goes to meet the dream once this is attained to perception, because it has been drawn thither by the excitation of consciousness, binds the unconscious excitation of the dream and renders it harmless as a disturber of sleep. When the dreamer wakes up for a moment, he has really chased away the fly that threatened to disturb his sleep. We may now begin to suspect that it is really more expedient and economical to give way to the unconscious wish, to leave clear its path to regression so that and it may form a dream, and then to bind and dispose of this dream by means of a small outlay of preconscious work, than to hold the unconscious in check throughout the whole period of sleep. It was, indeed, to be expected that the dream, even if originally it was not a purposeful process, would have seized upon some definite function in the play of forces of the psychic life. We now see what this function is. The dream has taken over the task of bringing the excitation of the UCs, which has been left free, back under the domination of the preconscious. It thus discharges the excitation of the UCs, acts as a safety valve for the latter, and at the same time, by a slight outlay of waking activity, secures the sleep of the preconscious. Thus, like the other psychic formations of its group, the dream offers itself as a compromise, serving both systems simultaneously by fulfilling the wishes of both insofar as they are mutually compatible. A glance at Roberts' elimination theory will show that we must agree with this author on his main point, namely, the determination of the function of dreams, though we differ from him in our general presuppositions and in our estimation of the dream process. Is this the only function which we can attribute to dreams? I know of no other. A. Maeder, to be sure, has endeavored to claim for the dream yet other secondary functions. He started from the just observation that many dreams contain attempts to provide solutions of conflicts which are afterwards actually carried through. They thus behave like preparatory practice for waking activities. He therefore drew a parallel between dreaming and the play of animals and children, which is to be conceived as a training of the inherited instincts, and a preparation for their later serious activity, thus setting up a fonction ludique for the dream. A little while before Maeder, Alfred Adler likewise emphasized the function of thinking ahead in the dream. But an obvious reflection must show that this secondary function of the dream has no claim to recognition within the framework of any dream interpretation. Thinking ahead, making resolutions, sketching out attempted solutions which can then perhaps be realized in waking life. These and many more performances are functions of the unconscious and preconscious activities of the mind which continue as day residues in the sleeping state and can then combine with an unconscious wish to form a dream. Chapter 7, C. The function of thinking ahead in the dream is thus rather a function of preconscious waking thought, the result of which may be disclosed to us by the analysis of dreams or other phenomena. After the dream has so long been fused with its manifest content, one must now guard against confusing it with the latent dream thoughts. The above qualification, in so far as the two wishes are mutually compatible, contains a suggestion that there may be cases in which the function of the dream fails. The dream process is, to begin with, admitted as a wish fulfillment of the unconscious. But if this attempted wish fulfillment disturbs the preconscious so profoundly that the latter can no longer maintain its state of rest, the dream has broken the compromise and has failed to perform the second part of its task. It is then at once broken off and replaced by complete awakening. But even here, it is not really the fault of the dream, if, though at other times the guardian, it has now to appear as the disturber of sleep, nor need this prejudice us against its avowed purposive character. This is not the only instance in the organism in which a contrivance that is usually to the purpose becomes inappropriate and disturbing so soon as something is altered in the conditions which engender it. The disturbance then at all events serves the new purpose of indicating the change, and of bringing into play against it the means of adjustment of the organism. Here, of course, I am thinking of the anxiety dream, and lest it should seem that I try to evade this witness against the theory of wish fulfillment whenever I encounter it, I will at least give some indications as to the explanation of the anxiety dream. That a psychic process which develops anxiety may still be a wish fulfillment has long ceased to imply any contradiction for us. We may explain this occurrence by the fact that the wish belongs to one system, the UCs, whereas the other system, the PCs, has rejected and suppressed it. The subjection of the UCs by the PCs is not thoroughgoing even in perfect psychic health. The extent of this suppression indicates the degree of our psychic normality. Neurotic symptoms indicate to us that the two systems are in mutual conflict. The symptoms are the result of a compromise in this conflict, and they temporarily put an end to it. On the other hand, they afford the UCs a way out for the discharge of its excitation. They serve it as a kind of sally gate, while, on the other hand, they give the PCs the possibility of dominating the UCs in some degree. It is instructive to consider, for example, the significance of a hysterical phobia or of agoraphobia. A neurotic is said to be incapable of crossing the street alone, and this we should rightly call a symptom. Let someone now remove this symptom by constraining him to this action which he deems himself incapable of performing. The result will be an attack of anxiety, just as an attack of anxiety in the street has often been the exciting cause of the establishment of an agoraphobia. We thus learn that the symptom has been constituted in order to prevent the anxiety from breaking out. The phobia is thrown up before the anxiety like a frontier fortress. We cannot enlarge further on this subject unless we examine the role of the effects in these processes, which can only be done here imperfectly. We will therefore affirm the proposition that the principal reason why the suppression of the UCs becomes necessary is that, if the movement of ideas in the UCs were allowed to run its course, it would develop an effect which originally had the character of pleasure, but which, since the process of repression bears the character of pain. The aim as well as the result of the suppression is to prevent the development of this pain. The suppression extends to the idea content of the UCs, because the liberation of pain might emanate from this idea content. We here take as our basis a quite definite assumption as to the nature of the development of affect. This is regarded as a motor or secretory function, the key to the innervation of which is to be found in the ideas of the UCs. Through the domination of the PCs, these ideas are as it were strangled, that is, inhibited from sending out the impulse that we could develop the effect. The danger which arises if cathexis by the PCs ceases thus consists in the fact that the unconscious excitations would liberate an effect that, in consequence of the repression that has previously occurred, could only be felt as pain or anxiety. This danger is released if the dream process is allowed to have its own way. The conditions for its realization are that repressions shall have occurred, and that the suppressed wish impulses can become sufficiently strong. They, therefore, fall entirely outside the psychological framework of dream formation. Were it not for the fact that our theme is connected by just one factor with the theme of the development of anxiety, namely by the setting free of the UCs during sleep, I could refrain from the discussion of the anxiety dream altogether, and thus avoid all the obscurities involved in it. The theory of the anxiety dreams belongs, as I have already repeatedly stated, to the psychology of the neuroses. I might further add that anxiety in dreams is an anxiety problem and not a dream problem. Having once exhibited the point of contact of the psychology of the neuroses with the theme of the dream process, we have nothing further to do with it. There is only one thing left which I can do. Since I have asserted that neurotic anxiety has its origin in sexual sources, I can subject anxiety dreams to analysis in order to demonstrate the sexual material in their dream thoughts. For good reasons, I refrain from citing any of the examples so abundantly placed at my disposal by neurotic patients, and prefer to give some anxiety dreams of children. Personally, I have had no real anxiety dream for decades, but I do recall one from my 7th or 8th year, which I subjected to interpretation some 30 years later. The dream was very vivid, and showed me my beloved mother, with a peculiarly calm, sleeping countenance, carried into the room and laid on the bed by 2 or 3 persons with birds' beaks. I awoke crying and screaming, and disturbed my parents' sleep. The peculiarly draped, excessively tall figures with beaks I had taken from the illustrations of Philipson's Bible. I believe they represented deities with the heads of sparrowhawks from an Egyptian tomb relief. The analysis yielded, however, also the recollection of a house porter's boy who used to play with us children on the meadow in front of the house. I might add that his name was Philip. It seemed to me then that I first heard from this boy the vulgar word signifying sexual intercourse, which is replaced among educated persons by the Latin word coitus, but which the dream plainly enough indicates by the choice of the birds' heads. I must have guessed the sexual significance of the word from the look of my worldly-wise teacher. My mother's expression in the dream was copied from the countenance of my grandfather, whom I had seen a few days before his death snoring in a state of coma. The interpretation of the secondary elaboration in the dream must therefore have been that my mother was dying. The tomb relief, too, agrees with this. I awoke with this anxiety and could not calm myself until I had waked my parents. I remember that I suddenly became calm when I saw my mother. It was as though I had needed the assurance. Then she was not dead. But this secondary interpretation of the dream had only taken place when the influence of the developed anxiety was already at work. I was not in a state of anxiety because I had dreamt that my mother was dying. I interpreted the dream in this manner in the preconscious elaboration because I was already under the domination of the anxiety. The latter, however, could be traced back through the repression to a dark, plainly sexual craving, which had found appropriate expression in the visual content of the dream. A man 27 years of age, who had been seriously ill for a year, had repeatedly dreamed between the ages of 11 and 13 dreams attended with great anxiety, to the effect that a man with a hatchet was running after him. He wanted to run away, but seemed to be paralyzed and could not move from the spot. This may be taken as a good and typical example of a very common anxiety dream, free from any suspicion of a sexual meaning. In the analysis, the dreamer first thought of a story told him by his uncle, chronologically later than the dream, viz., that he was attacked at night in the street by a suspicious-looking individual, and he concluded from this association that he might have heard of a similar episode at the time of the dream. In association with the hatchet, he recalled that during this period of his life he once hurt his hand with a hatchet while chopping wood. This immediately reminded him of his relations with his younger brother, whom he used to maltreat and knock down. He recalled in particular one occasion when he hit his brother's head with his boot and made it bleed, and his mother said, "I'm afraid he will kill him one day." While he seemed to be thus held by the theme of violence, a memory from his 9th year suddenly emerged. His parents had come home late and had gone to bed, whilst he was pretending to be asleep. He soon heard panting, and other sounds that seemed to him mysterious, and he could also guess the position of his parents in bed. His further thoughts showed that he had established an analogy between his relation between his parents and his own relation to his younger brother. He subsumed what was happening between his parents under the notion of an act of violence and a fight. The fact that he had frequently noticed blood in his mother's bed corroborated this conception. That the sexual intercourse of adults appears strange and alarming to children who observe it and arouses anxiety in them is, I may say, a fact established by everyday experience. I have explained this anxiety on the ground that we have here a sexual excitation which is not mastered by the child's understanding, and which probably also encounters repulsion because their parents are involved, and is therefore transformed into anxiety. At a still earlier period of life, the sexual impulse toward the parents of opposite sex does not yet suffer repression, but as we have seen, Chapter 5d expresses itself freely. For the night terrors with hallucinations, pavor nocturnus, so frequent in children, I should without hesitation offer the same explanation. These two can only be due to misunderstood and rejected sexual impulses which, if recorded, would probably show a temporal periodicity, since an intensification of sexual libido may equally be produced by accidentally exciting impressions and by spontaneous periodic processes of development. I have not the necessary observational material for the full demonstration of this explanation. On the other hand, pediatrists seem to lack the point of view which alone makes intelligible the whole series of phenomena, both from the somatic and from the psychic side. To illustrate by a comical example how closely, if one is made blind by the blinkers of medical mythology, one may pass by the understanding of such cases. I will cite a case which I found in a thesis on Pavor Nocturnus, de Backer, 1881, page 66. A boy of 13 in delicate health began to be anxious and dreamy. His sleep became uneasy, and once almost every week it was interrupted by an acute attack of anxiety with hallucinations. The memory of these dreams was always very distinct. Thus he was able to relate that the devil had shouted at him, "Now we have you, now we have you," and then there was a smell of pitch and brimstone, and the fire burned his skin. From this dream he awoke in terror. At first he could not cry out, then his voice came back to him, and he was distinctly heard to say, "No, no, not me, I haven't done anything," or, "Please don't, I will never do it again." At other times he said, "Albert has never done that." Later he avoided undressing because the fire attacked him only when he was undressed. In the midst of these evil dreams, which were endangering his health, he was sent into the country, where he recovered in the course of 18 months. At the age of 15 he confessed one day, "I did not dare admit it, but I continually felt tinglings and over-excitements of the parts. At the end it wearied me so much that several times I thought to throw myself from the dormitory window. It is of course not difficult to guess, 1. That the boy had practiced masturbation in former years, that he had probably denied it, and was threatened with severe punishment for his bad habit. His confession, "I will not do it again," his denial, "Albert never did that," that, under the advancing pressure of puberty, the temptation to masturbate was reawakened through the titillation of the genitals. 3. That now, however, there arose within him a struggle for repression, which suppressed the libido and transformed it into anxiety, and that this anxiety now gathered up the punishments with which he was originally threatened. Let us, on the other hand, see what conclusions were drawn by the author, page 69. 1. It is clear from this observation that the influence of puberty may produce in a boy of delicate health a condition of extreme weakness, and that this may lead to a very marked cerebral anemia. 2. This cerebral anemia produces an alteration of character, demonomaniacal hallucinations, and very violent nocturnal, and perhaps also diurnal states of anxiety. 3. The demonomania and the self-reproaches of the boy can be traced to the influences of a religious education which had acted upon him as a child. 4. All manifestations disappeared as a result of a lengthy sojourn in the country, bodily exercise, and the return of physical strength after the termination of puberty. 5. Possibly an influence predisposing to the development of the boy's cerebral state may be attributed to heredity and to the father's former syphilis. Then finally come to the concluding remarks. We put this case in the file of apyretic delirias of inanition, for it is to cerebral anemia that we attach this particular state. End of section 44. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto, Birmingham, Alabama. Section 45 of the Interpretation of Dreams. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto. The Interpretation of Dreams by Sigmund Freud. Translated by A. Brill. Section 45. The Primary and Secondary Processes, Repression. In attempting to penetrate more profoundly into the psychology of the dream processes, I have undertaken a difficult task, to which, indeed, my powers of exposition are hardly adequate. To reproduce the simultaneity of so complicated a scheme in terms of a successive description, and at the same time to make each part appear free from all assumption, goes fairly beyond my powers. I have now to atone for the fact that in my exposition of the psychology of dreams, I have been unable to follow the historic development of my own insight. The lines of approach to the comprehension of the dream were laid down for me by previous investigations into the psychology of the neuroses, to which I should not refer here, although I am constantly obliged to do so. Whereas I should like to work in the opposite direction, starting from the dream and then proceeding to establish its junction with the psychology of the neuroses. I am conscious of all the difficulties which this involves for the reader, but I know of no way to avoid them. Since I am dissatisfied with this state of affairs, I am glad to dwell upon another point of view, which would seem to enhance the value of my efforts. As was shown in the introductory section, I found myself confronted with a theme which had been marked by the sharpest contradictions on the part of those who had written on it. In the course of our treatment of the problems of the dream, room has been found for most of these contradictory views. We have been compelled to take decided exception to two only of the views expressed, namely, that the dream is a meaningless process, and that it is a somatic process. Apart from these, we have been able to find a place for the truth of all the contradictory opinions at one point or another of the complicated tissue of the facts, and we have been able to show that each expressed something genuine and correct. That our dreams continue the impulses and interests of waking life have been generally confirmed by the discovery of the hidden dream thoughts. These concern themselves only with things that seem to us important and of great interest. Dreams never occupy themselves with trifles, but we have accepted also the opposite view, namely, that the dream gathers up the indifferent residues of the day and cannot seize upon any important interest of the day until it has in some measure withdrawn itself from waking activity. We have found that this holds true of the dream content, which by means of distortion gives the dream thought an altered expression. We have said that the dream process, owing to the nature of the mechanism of association, finds it easier to obtain possession of recent or indifferent material, which has not yet been put under an embargo by our waking mental activity. and that, on account of the censorship, it transfers the psychic intensity of the significant but also objectionable material to the indifferent. The hypermnesia of the dream and its ability to dispose of infantile material have become the main foundation of our doctrine. In our theory of dreams, we have assigned to a wish of infantile origin the part of the indispensable motive power of dream formation. It has not, of course, occurred to us to doubt the experimentally demonstrated significance of external sensory stimuli during sleep, but we have placed this material in the same relation to the dream wish as the thought residues left over from our waking activity. We need not dispute the fact that the dream interprets objective sensory stimuli after the manner of an illusion, but we have supplied the motive for this interpretation, which has been left indeterminate by other writers. The interpretation proceeds in such a way that the perceived object is rendered harmless as a source of disturbance of sleep, whilst it is made usable for the wish fulfillment. Though we do not admit as a special source of dreams the subjective state of excitation of the sensory organs during sleep, which seems to have been demonstrated by Trumbull Ladd, we are nevertheless able to explain this state of excitation by the regressive revival of the memories active behind the dream. As to the internal organic sensations, which are wont to be taken as the cardinal point of the explanation of dreams, these, too, find a place in our conception, though indeed a more modest one. These sensations, the sensations of falling, of soaring, or of being inhibited, represent an ever-ready material which the dream work can employ to express the dream thought as often as need arises. That the dream process is a rapid and momentary one is, we believe, true as regards the perception by consciousness of the preformed dream content, but we have found that the preceding portions of the dream process probably follow a slow, fluctuating course. As for the riddle of the superabundant dream content compressed into the briefest moment of time, we have been able to contribute the explanation that the dream seizes upon ready-made formations of the psychic life. We have found that it is true that dreams are distorted and mutilated by the memory, but that this fact presents no difficulties, as it is only the last manifest portion of a process of distortion which has been going on from the very beginning of the dream work. In the embittered controversy which has seemed irreconcilable, whether the psychic life is asleep at night or can make the same use of all its faculties as during the day, we have been able to conclude that both sides are right, but that neither is entirely so. In the dream thoughts we found evidence of a highly complicated intellectual activity, operating with almost all the resources of the psychic apparatus. Yet it cannot be denied that these dream thoughts have originated during the day, and it is indispensable to assume that there is a sleeping state of the psychic life. Thus even the doctrine of partial sleep received its due, but we have found the characteristic feature of the sleeping state not in the disintegration of the psychic system of connections, but in the special attitude adopted by the psychic system which is dominant during the day, the attitude of the wish to sleep. The deflection from the outer world retains its significance for our view, too. Though not the only factor at work, it helps to make possible the regressive course of the dream representation. The abandonment of voluntary guidance of the flow of ideas is incontestable, but psychic life does not thereby become aimless, for we have seen that upon relinquishment of the voluntary directing ideas, involuntary ones take charge. On the other hand, we have not only recognized the loose associative connection of the dream, but have brought a far greater area within the scope of this kind of connection than could have been suspected. We have, however, found it merely an enforced substitute for another, a correct and significant type of association. To be sure, we too have called the dream absurd, but examples have shown us how wise the dream is when it simulates absurdity. As regards the functions that have been attributed to the dream, we are able to accept them all, that the dream relieves the mind like a safety valve, and that, as Robert has put it, all kinds of harmful material are rendered harmless by representation in the dream, not only coincides exactly with our own theory of the twofold wish fulfillment in the dream, but in its very wording becomes more intelligible for us than it is for Robert himself. The free indulgence of the psyche in the play of its faculties is reproduced in our theory as the non-interference of the preconscious activity with the dream. The return of the embryonal standpoint of psychic life in the dream, and Havelock Ellis's remark that the dream is an archaic world of vast emotions and imperfect thoughts, appear to us as happy anticipations of our own exposition, which asserts that primitive modes of operations that we suppress during the day play a part in the formation of dreams. We can fully identify ourselves with Sully's statement that, Our dreams bring back again our earlier and successively developed personalities, our old ways of regarding things, with impulses and modes of reaction which ruled us long ago. And for us, as for Delage, the suppressed material becomes the mainspring of the dream. We have fully accepted the role that Schörner ascribes to the dream fantasy, and his own interpretations, but we have been obliged to transpose them, as it were, to another part of the problem. It is not the dream that creates the fantasy, but the activity of unconscious fantasy that plays the leading part in the formation of the dream thoughts. We remain indebted to Schörner for directing us to the source of the dream thoughts, but almost everything that he ascribes to the dream works is attributable to the activity of the unconscious during the day, which instigates dreams no less than neurotic symptoms. The dream work we had to separate from this activity as something quite different and far more closely controlled. Finally, we have by no means renounced the relation of the dream to psychic disturbances, but have given it on new ground a more solid foundation. Held together by the new features in our theory, as by a superior unity, we find the most varied and most contradictory conclusions of other writers fitting into our structure. Many of them are given a different turn, but only a few of them are wholly rejected. But our own structure is still unfinished, for apart from the many obscure questions in which we have involved ourselves by our advance into the dark regions of psychology, we are now, it would seem, embarrassed by a new contradiction. On the one hand, we have made it appear that the dream thoughts proceed from perfectly normal psychic activities, but on the other hand, we have found among the dream thoughts a number of entirely abnormal mental processes which extend also to the dream content, and which we reproduce in the interpretation of the dream. All that we have termed the dream work seems to depart so completely from the psychic processes which we recognize as correct and appropriate, that the severest judgments expressed by the writers mentioned as to the low level of psychic achievement of dreams must appear well-founded. Here perhaps only further investigation can provide an explanation and set us on the right path. Let me pick out for renewed attention one of the constellations which lead to dream formation. We have learned that the dream serves as a substitute for a number of thoughts derived from our daily life and which fit together with perfect logic. We cannot therefore doubt that these thoughts have their own origin in our normal mental life. All the qualities which we value in our thought processes and which mark them out as complicated performances of a higher order, we shall find repeated in the dream thoughts. There is, however, no need to assume that this mental work is performed during sleep. Such an assumption would badly confuse the conception of the psychic state of sleep to which we have hitherto adhered. On the contrary, these thoughts may very well have their origin in the daytime, and unremarked by our consciousness may have gone on from their first stimulus until at the onset of sleep they have reached completion. If we are to conclude anything from this state of affairs, it can only be that it proves that the most complex mental operations are possible without the cooperation of consciousness, a truth which we have had to learn anyhow from every psychoanalysis of a patient suffering from hysteria or obsessions. These dream thoughts are certainly not in themselves incapable of consciousness. If we have not become conscious of them during the day, this may have been due to various reasons. The act of becoming conscious depends upon a definite psychic function, attention being brought to bear. This seems to be available only in a determinate quantity, which may have been diverted from the train of thought in question by other aims. Another way in which such trains of thoughts may be withheld from consciousness is the following. From our conscious reflection, we know that, when applying our attention, we follow a particular course, but if that course leads us to an idea which cannot withstand criticism, we break off and allow the cathexis of attention to drop. Now, it would seem that the train of thought thus started and abandoned may continue to develop without our attention returning to it, unless at some point it attains a specially high intensity which compels attention. An initial conscious rejection by our judgment on the ground of incorrectness or uselessness for the immediate purpose of the act of thought may therefore be the cause of a thought process going on unnoticed by consciousness until the onset of sleep. Let us now recapitulate. We call such a train of thought a preconscious train, and we believe it to be perfectly correct, and that it may equally well be a merely neglected train or one that has been interrupted and suppressed. Let us also state in plain terms how we visualize the movement of our thought. We believe that a certain quantity of excitation, which we call cathectic energy, is displaced from a purposive idea along the association paths selected by this directing idea. A neglected train of thought has received no such cathexis,
and the cathexis has been withdrawn from one that was suppressed or rejected, both have thus been left to their own excitations. The train of thought cathected by some aim becomes able, under certain conditions, to attract the attention of consciousness, and by the mediation of consciousness it then receives hypercathexis. We shall be obliged presently to elucidate our assumptions as to the nature and function of consciousness. A train of thought thus incited in the PCs may either disappear spontaneously or it may continue. The former eventuality we conceive as follows. It diffuses its energy through all the association paths emanating from it and throws the entire chain of thoughts into a state of excitation, which continues for a while and then subsides, through the excitation which had called for a discharge being transformed into dormant cathexis. If this first eventuality occurs, the process has no further significance for dream formation, but other directing ideas are lurking in our preconscious, which have their source in our unconscious and ever-active wishes. These may gain control of the excitation in the circle of thoughts thus left to itself, establish a connection between it and the unconscious wish, and transfer it to the energy inherent in the unconscious wish. Henceforth, the neglected or suppressed train of thought is in a position to maintain itself, although this reinforcement gives it no claim to access to consciousness. We may say, then, that the hitherto preconscious train of thought has been drawn into the unconscious. Other constellations leading to dream formation might be as follows. The preconscious train of thought might have been connected from the beginning with the unconscious wish, and for that reason might have met with rejection by the dominating aim, cathexis. Or an unconscious wish might become active for other, possibly somatic reasons, and of its own accord seek a transference to the psychic residues not cathected by the PCs. All three cases have the same result. There is established in the preconscious a train of thought which, having been abandoned by the preconscious cathexis, has acquired cathexis from the unconscious wish. From this point onward, the train of thought is subjected to a series of transformations which we no longer recognize as normal psychic processes and which give a result that we find strange, a psychopathological formation. Let us now emphasize and bring together these transformations. 1. The intensities of the individual ideas become capable of discharge in their entirety and pass from one idea to another, so that individual ideas are formed which are endowed with great intensity. Through the repeated occurrence of their process, the intensity of an entire train of thought may ultimately be concentrated in a single conceptual unit. This is the fact of compression or condensation with which we become acquainted when investigating the dream work. It is condensation that is mainly responsible for the strange impression produced by dreams, for we know of nothing analogous to it in the normal psychic life that is accessible to consciousness. We get here, too, ideas which are of great psychic significance as nodal points or as end results of whole chains of thought, but this value is not expressed by any character actually manifest for our internal perception. What is represented in it is not in any way made more intensive. In the process of condensation, the whole set of psychic connections becomes transformed into the intensity of the idea content. The situation is the same as when, in the case of a book, I italicize or print in heavy type any word to which I attach outstanding value for the understanding of the text. In speech, I should pronounce the same word loudly and deliberately and with emphasis. The first simile points immediately to one of the examples which were given of the dream work triethylamine in the dream of Irma's injection. Historians of art call our attention to the fact that the most ancient sculptures known to history follow a similar principle in expressing the rank of the persons represented by the size of the statues. The king is made 2 or 3 times as tall as his retinue or his vanquished enemies. But a work of art of the Roman period makes use of more subtle means to accomplish the same end. The figure of the emperor is placed in the center, erect and in his full height, and special care is bestowed on the modeling of this figure. His enemies are seen cowering at his feet, but he is no longer made to seem a giant among dwarfs. At the same time, in the bowing of the subordinate to his superior, even in our own day, we have an echo of this ancient principle of representation. The direction followed by the condensation of the dream is prescribed on the one hand by the true preconscious relations of the dream thoughts, and on the other hand by the attraction of the visual memories in the unconscious. The success of the condensation work produces those intensities which are required for penetration to the perception system. 2. By free transference of intensities, and in the service of the condensation, intermediary ideas, compromises, as it were, are formed. Reference the numerous examples. This also is something unheard of in the normal movement of our ideas, where what is of most importance is the selection and the retention of the right conceptual material. On the other hand, composite and compromise formations occur with extraordinary frequency when we are trying to find verbal expression for preconscious thoughts. These are considered slips of the tongue. 3. The ideas which transfer their intensities to one another are very loosely connected and are joined together by such forms of association as are disdained by our serious thinking, and left to be exploited solely by wit. In particular, assonances and punning associations are treated as equal in value to any other associations. 4. Contradictory thoughts do not try to eliminate one another, but continue side by side, and often combine to form condensation products, as though no contradiction existed. Or they form compromises for which we should never forgive our thought, but which we frequently sanction in our action. These are some of the most conspicuous abnormal processes to which the dream thoughts which have previously been rationally formed are subjected in the course of the dream work. As the main feature of these processes, we may see that the greatest importance is attached to rendering the cathectic energy mobile and capable of discharge. The content and the intrinsic significance of the psychic elements to which these cathexes adhere become matters of secondary importance. One might perhaps assume that condensation and compromise formation are effected only in the service of regression, when the occasion arises for changing thoughts to images. But the analysis, and still more plainly the synthesis, of such dreams as show no regression towards images, for example, the dream Autodidaska, Conversation with Professor N, reveals the same processes of displacement and condensation as do the rest. We cannot therefore avoid the conclusion that two kinds of essentially different psychic processes participate in dream formation. One forms perfectly correct and fitting dream thoughts equivalent to the results of normal thinking, while the other deals with these thoughts in a most astonishing and, as it seems, incorrect way. The latter processes we have already set apart in Chapter 6 as the dream work proper. What can we say now as to the derivation of this psychic process? It would be impossible to answer this question here if we had not penetrated a considerable way into the psychology of the neuroses and especially of hysteria. From this, however, we learn that the same incorrect psychic processes, as well as others not enumerated, control the production of hysterical symptoms. In hysteria, too, we find at first a series of perfectly correct and fitting thoughts, equivalent to our conscious ones, of whose existence in this form we can, however, learn nothing, that is, which we can only subsequently reconstruct. If they have forced their way anyway to perception, we discover from the analysis of the symptom formed that these normal thoughts have been subjected to abnormal treatment, and that by means of condensation and compromise function, through superficial associations which cover up contradictions, and eventually along the path of regression, they have been conveyed into the symptom. In view of the complete identity between the peculiarities of the dream work and those of the psychic activity which issues in psychoneurotic symptoms, we shall feel justified in transferring to the dream the conclusions urged upon us by hysteria. From the theory of hysteria, we borrow the proposition that such an abnormal psychic elaboration of a normal train of thought takes place only when the latter has been used for the transference of an unconscious wish which dares from the infantile life and is in a state of repression. Complying with this proposition, we have built up the theory of the dream on the assumption that the actuating dream wish invariably originates in the unconscious, which, as we have ourselves admitted, cannot be universally demonstrated, even though it cannot be refuted. But in order to enable us to say just what repression is, after employing this term so freely, we shall be obliged to make a further addition to our psychological scaffolding. We had elaborated the fiction of a primitive psychic apparatus, the work of which is regulated by the effort to avoid accumulation of excitation and as far as possible to maintain itself free from excitation. For this reason, it was constructed after the plan of a reflex apparatus. Motility, in the first place, as the path to changes within the body, was the channel of discharge at its disposal. We then discussed the psychic results of experiences of gratification and were able at this point to introduce a second assumption, namely, that the accumulation of excitation by processes that do not concern us here is felt as pain and sets the apparatus in operation in order to bring about again a state of gratification in which the diminution of excitation is perceived as pleasure. Such a current in the apparatus, issuing from pain and striving for pleasure, we call a wish. We have said that nothing but a wish is capable of setting the apparatus in motion, and that the course of any excitation in the apparatus is regulated automatically by the perception of pleasure and pain. The first occurrence of wishing may well have taken the form of a hallucinatory cathexis of the memory of gratification. But this hallucination, unless it could be maintained to the point of exhaustion, proved incapable of bringing about a cessation of the need, and consequently of securing the pleasure connected with gratification. Thus, there was required a second activity, in our terminology, the activity of a second system, which would not allow the memory, cathexis, to force its way to perception and thence to bind the psychic forces, but would lead the excitation emanating from the need stimulus by a detour, which by means of voluntary motility would ultimately so change the outer world as to permit the real perception of the gratifying object. Thus far we have already elaborated the scheme of the psychic apparatus. These two systems are the germ of what we set up in the fully developed apparatus as the UCs and PCs. To change the outer world appropriately by means of motility requires the accumulation of a large total of experiences in the memory system, as well as a manifold consolidation of the relations which are evoked in this memory material by various directing ideas. We will now proceed further with our assumption. The activity of the second system, groping in many directions, tentatively sending forth cathexes and retracing them, needs on the one hand full command over all memory material, but on the other hand it would be a superfluous expenditure of energy were it to send along the individual thought paths large quantities of cathexes, which would then flow away to no purpose, and thus diminish the quantity needed for changing the outer world. Out of a regard for purposiveness, therefore, I postulate that the second system succeeds in maintaining the greater part of the energetic cathexis in a state of rest, and in using only a small portion for its operation of displacement. The mechanics of these processes is entirely unknown to me. Anyone who seriously wishes to follow up these ideas must address himself to the physical analogies and find some way of getting a picture of the sequence of motions which ensue on the excitation of the neurons. Here I do no more than hold fast to the idea that the activity of the first psi system aims at the free outflow of the quantities of excitation, and that the second system, by means of the cathexes emanating from it, effects an inhibition of this outflow, a transformation into dormant cathexis, probably with a rise of potential. I therefore assume that the course taken by any excitation under the control of the second system is bound to quite different mechanical conditions from those which obtain under the control of the first system. After the second system has completed its work of experimental thought, it removes the inhibition and damming up of the excitations and allows them to flow off into motility. An interesting train of thought now presents itself if we consider the relations of this inhibition of discharge by the second system to the process of regulation by the pain principle. Let us now seek out the counterpart of the primary experience of gratification, namely the objective experience of fear. Let a perception stimulus act on the primitive apparatus and be the source of a pain excitation. There will then ensue uncoordinated motor manifestations which will go on until one of these withdraws the apparatus from perception and at the same time from the pain. On the reappearance of the percept, this manifestation will immediately be repeated, perhaps as a movement of flight, until the percept has again disappeared. But in this case no tendency will remain to recaffect the perception of the source of pain by hallucination or otherwise. On the contrary, there will be a tendency in the evoke, or more precisely, begin to evoke pain. This turning away from a recollection, which is merely a repetition of the former flight from perception, is also facilitated by the fact that unlike the perception, the recollection has not enough quality to arouse consciousness and thereby to attract fresh cathexis. This effortless and regular turning away of the psychic process from the memory of anything that had once been painful gives us the prototype and the first example of psychic repression. We all know how much of this turning away from the painful, the tactics of the ostrich, may still be shown as present even in the normal psychic life of adults. In obedience to the pain principle, therefore, the first psi system is quite incapable of introducing anything unpleasant into the thought nexus. The system cannot do anything but wish. If this were to remain so, the activity of thought of the second system, which needs to have at its disposal all the memories stored up by experience, would be obstructed. But two paths are now open. Either the work of the second system frees itself completely from the pain principle and continues its course, paying no heed to the pain attached to given memories, or it contrives to affect the memory of the pain in such a manner as to preclude the liberation of pain. We can reject the first possibility, as the pain principle also proves to act as a regulator of the cycle of excitation in the second system. We are therefore thrown back upon the second possibility, namely, that this system affects a memory in such a manner as to inhibit any outflow of excitation from it, and hence also the outflow comparable to a motor innervation needed for the development of pain. And thus, setting out from two different starting points, that is, from regard for the pain principle and from the principle of the least expenditure of innervation, we are led to the hypothesis that cathexis through the second system is at the same time an inhibition of the discharge of excitation. Let us, however, keep a close hold on the fact, for this is the key to the theory of repression, that the second system can only affect an idea when it is in a position to inhibit any pain emanating from this idea. Anything that withdraws itself from this inhibition would also remain inaccessible for the second system, that is, would immediately be given up by virtue of the pain principle. The inhibition of pain, however, need not be complete. It must be permitted to begin, since this indicates to the second system the nature of the memory, and possibly its lack of fitness for the purpose sought by the process of thought. The psychic process which is alone tolerated by the first system I shall now call the primary process, and that which results under the inhibiting action of the second system I shall call the secondary process. I can also show at another point for what purpose the second system is obliged to correct the primary process. The primary process strives for discharge of the excitation in order to establish with the quantity of excitation thus collected an identity of perception. The secondary process has abandoned this intention and has adopted instead the aim of an identity of thought. All thinking is merely a detour from the memory of gratification, taken as a purposive idea, to the identical cathexis of the same memory, which is to be reached once more by the path of motor experiences. Thought must concern itself with the connecting paths between ideas without allowing itself to be misled by their intensities. But it is obvious that condensation of ideas and intermediate or compromise formations are obstacles to the attainment of the identity which is aimed at. By substituting one idea for another, they swerve away from the path which would have led onward from the first idea. Such procedures are, therefore, carefully avoided in our secondary thinking. It will readily be seen, moreover, that the pain principle, although at other times it provides the thought process with its most important clues, may also put difficulties in its way in the pursuit of identity of thought. Hence, the tendency of the thinking process must always be to free itself more and more from exclusive regulation by the pain principle, and to restrict the development of effect through the work of thought to the very minimum which remains effective as a signal. This refinement in functioning is to be achieved by a fresh hypercathexis effected with the help of consciousness. But we are aware that this refinement is seldom successful even in normal psychic life, and that our thinking always remains liable to falsification by the intervention of the pain principle. This, however, is not the breach in the functional efficiency of our psychic apparatus which makes it possible for thoughts representing the result of the secondary thought work to fall into the power of the primary psychic process, by which formula we may now describe the operations resulting in dreams and the symptoms of hysteria. This inadequacy results from the converging of two factors in our development, one of which pertains solely to the psychic apparatus and has exercised a determining influence on the relation of the two systems, while the other operates fluctuatingly and introduces motive forces of organic origin into the psychic life. Both originate in the infantile life and are a precipitate of the alteration which our psychic and somatic organism has undergone since our infantile years. When I termed one of the psychic processes in the psychic apparatus the primary process, I did not do so only in consideration of its status and function, but was also able to take account of the temporal relationship actually involved. So far as we know, a psychic apparatus possessing only the primary process does not exist, and is to that extent a theoretical fiction. But this at least is a fact, that the primary processes are present in the apparatus from the beginning, while the secondary processes only take shape gradually during the course of life, inhibiting and overlaying the primary, whilst gaining complete control over them, perhaps only in the prime of life. Owing to this belated arrival of the secondary processes, the essence of our being consisting of unconscious wish impulses, remains something which cannot be grasped or inhibited by the preconscious, and its part is once and for all restricted to indicating the most appropriate paths for the wish impulses originating in the unconscious. These unconscious wishes represent for all subsequent psychic strivings a compulsion to which they must submit themselves, although they may perhaps endeavor to divert them and to guide them to superior aims. In consequence of this retardation, an extensive region of the memory material remains in fact inaccessible to preconscious cathexis. Now, among these wish impulses originating in the infantile life, indestructible and incapable of inhibition, there are some the fulfillments of which have come to be in contradiction with the purposive ideas of our secondary thinking. The fulfillment of these wishes would no longer produce an effect of pleasure, but one of pain, and it is just this conversion of affect that constitutes the essence of what we call repression. In what manner and by what motive forces such a conversion can take place constitutes the problem of repression, which we need here only to touch upon in passing. It will suffice to note the fact that such a conversion of affect occurs in the course of development. One need only to think of the emergence of disgust, originally absent in infantile life, and that it is connected with the activity of the secondary system. The memories from which the unconscious wish evokes a liberation of affect have never been accessible to the PCs, and for that reason this liberation cannot be inhibited. It is precisely on account of this generation of affect that these ideas are not now accessible even by way of the preconscious thoughts to which they have transferred the energy of the wishes connected with them. On the contrary, the pain principle comes into play and causes the PCs to turn away from these transference thoughts. These latter are left to themselves, are repressed, and thus the existence of a store of infantile memories withdrawn from the beginning from the PCs become the preliminary condition of repression. In the most favorable case, the generation of pain terminates so soon as the cathexis is withdrawn from the transference thoughts in the PCs, and this result shows that the intervention of the pain principle is appropriate. It is otherwise, however, if the repressed unconscious wish receives an organic reinforcement which it can put at the service of its transference thoughts, and by which it can enable them to attempt to break through with their excitation, even if the cathexis of the PCs has been taken away from them. A defensive struggle then ensues, inasmuch as the PCs reinforces the opposite to the repressed thoughts, counter-cathexis, and the eventual outcome is that the transference thoughts, the carriers of the unconscious wish, break through in some form of compromise through symptom formation. But from the moment that the repressed thoughts are powerfully cathected by the unconscious wish impulse, but forsaken by the preconscious cathexis, they succumb to the primary psychic process and aim only at motor discharge. Or, if the way is clear, all hallucinatory revival of the desired identity of perception. We have already found empirically that the incorrect processes described are enacted only with thoughts which are in a state of repression. We are now in a position to grasp yet another part of the total scheme of the facts. These incorrect processes are the primary processes of the psychic apparatus. They occur whenever ideas abandoned by the preconscious cathexis are left to themselves and can become filled with uninhibited energy which flows from the unconscious and strives for discharge. There are further facts which go to show that the processes described as incorrect are not really falsifications of our normal procedure or defective thinking, but the modes of operation of the psychic apparatus when freed from inhibition. Thus we see that the process of the conveyance of the preconscious excitation to motility occurs in accordance with the same procedure, and that in the linkage of preconscious ideas with words we may easily find manifested the same displacements and confusions which we ascribe to inattention. Finally, a proof of the increased work made necessary by the inhibition of these primary modes of procedure might be found in the fact that we achieve a comical effect, a surplus to be discharged through laughter, if we allow these modes of thought to come to consciousness. The theory of the psychoneuroses asserts with absolute certainty that it can only be sexual wish impulses from the infantile life which have undergone repression, affect conversion, during the developmental period of childhood, which are capable of renewal at later periods of development, whether as a result of our sexual constitution, which has of course grown out of an original bisexuality, or in consequence of unfavorable influences in our sexual life, and which therefore supply the motive power for all psychoneurotic symptom formation. It is only by the introduction of these sexual forces that the gaps still demonstrable in the theory of repression can be filled. Here I will leave it undecided whether the postulate of the sexual and infantile holds good for the theory of dreams as well. I am not completing the latter, because in assuming that the dream wish invariably originates in the unconscious, I have already gone a step beyond the demonstrable. Nor will I inquire further into the nature of the difference between the play of psychic forces in dream formation and in the formation of hysterical symptoms, since there is missing here the needed fuller knowledge of one of the two things to be compared. But there is another point which I regard as important, and I will confess at once that it was only on account of this point that I entered upon all the discussions concerning the two psychic systems, their modes of operation, and the fact of repression. It does not greatly matter whether I have conceived the psychological relations at issue with approximate correctness, or, as is easily possible in such a difficult matter, wrongly and imperfectly. However our views may change about the interpretation of the psychic censorship or the correct and the abnormal elaboration of the dream content, it remains certain that such processes are active in dream formation, and that in their essentials they reveal the closest analogy with the processes observed in the formation of hysterical symptoms. Now the dream is not a pathological phenomenon. It does not presuppose any disturbance of our psychic equilibrium, and it does not leave behind it any weakening of our efficiency or capacities. The objection that no conclusions can be drawn about the dream of healthy persons from my own dreams and from those of my neurotic patients may be rejected without comment. If then from the nature of the given phenomena we infer the nature of their motive forces, we find that the psychic mechanism utilized by the neuroses is not newly created by a morbid disturbance that lays hold of the psychic life, but lies in readiness in the normal structure of our psychic apparatus. The two psychic systems, the frontier censorship between them, the inhibition and overlaying of the one activity by the other, the relations of both to consciousness or whatever may take place of these concepts on a juster interpretation of the actual relations, all these belong to the normal structure of our psychic instrument, and the dream shows us one of the paths which lead to a knowledge of this structure. If we wish to be content with a minimum of perfectly assured additions to our knowledge, we shall say that the dream affords proof that the suppressed material continues to exist even in the normal person and remains capable of psychic activity. Dreams are one of the manifestations of this suppressed material. Theoretically, this is true in all cases, and in tangible experience it has been found true in at least a great number of cases which happen to display most plainly the most striking features of the dream life. The suppressed psychic material, which in the waking state has been prevented from expression and cut off from internal perception by the mutual neutralization of contradictory attitudes, finds ways and means, under the sway of compromise formations, of obtruding itself on consciousness during the night. Flectere sinecio superos archeronta movebo. At any rate, the interpretation of dreams is via regia to a knowledge of the unconscious element in our psychic life. End of section 45. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto, Birmingham, Alabama.
Section 46 of The Interpretation of Dreams. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto. The Interpretation of Dreams by Sigmund Freud. Translated by A. Brill. Section 46. The Unconscious and Conscious. Reality. If we look more closely, we may observe that the psychological considerations examined in the foregoing chapter require us to assume not the existence of two systems near the motor end of the psychic apparatus, but two kinds of processes or courses taken by excitation. But this does not disturb us, for we must always be ready to drop our auxiliary ideas when we think we are in a position to replace them by something which comes closer to the unknown reality. Let us now try to correct certain views which may have taken a misconceived form as long as we regarded the two systems. Let us now try to correct certain views which may have taken a misconceived form as long as we regarded the two systems in the crudest and the most obvious sense, as two localities within the psychic apparatus, views which have left a precipitate in the terms of repression and penetration. Thus, when we say that an unconscious thought strives for translation into the preconscious in order subsequently to penetrate through to consciousness, we do not mean that a second idea has to be formed in a new locality, like a paraphrase, as it were, whilst the original persists by its side. And similarly, when we speak of penetration into consciousness, we wish carefully to detach from this notion any idea of a change of locality. When we say that a preconscious idea is repressed and subsequently absorbed by the unconscious, we might be tempted by these images, borrowed from the idea of a struggle for a particular territory, to assume that an arrangement is really broken up in the one psychic locality and replaced by a new one in the other locality. For these comparisons we will substitute a description which would seem to correspond more closely to the real state of affairs. We will say that an energetic cathexis is shifted to or withdrawn from a certain arrangement, so that the psychic formation falls under the domination of a given instance or is withdrawn from it. Here again we replace a topographical mode of representation by a dynamic one. It is not the psychic formation that appears to us as the mobile element, but its innovation. Nevertheless, I think it expedient and justifiable to continue to use the illustrative idea of the two systems. We shall avoid any abuse of this mode of representation if we remember that ideas, thoughts, and psychic formations in general must not in any case be localized in the inorganic elements of the nervous system, but, so to speak, between them, where resistances and association tracks form the correlate corresponding to them. Everything that can become an object of internal perception is virtual, like the image in the telescope produced by the crossing of light rays. But we are justified in thinking of the systems which have nothing psychic in themselves, and which never become accessible to our psychic perception, as something similar to the lenses of the telescope which project the image. If we continue this comparison, we might say that the censorship between the two systems corresponds to the refraction of rays on passing into a new medium. Thus far, we have developed our psychology on our own responsibility. It is now time to turn and look at the doctrines prevailing in modern psychology, and to examine the relation of these to our theories. The problem of the unconscious in psychology is, according to the forcible statement of Lipps, less a psychological problem than the problem of psychology. As long as psychology disposed of this problem by the verbal explanation that the psychic is a conscious, and that unconscious psychic occurrences are an obvious contradiction, there was no possibility of a physician's observations of abnormal mental states being turned to any psychological account. The physician and the philosopher can meet only when both acknowledge that unconscious psychic processes is the appropriate and justified expression for all established fact. The physician cannot but reject, with a shrug of his shoulders, the assertion that consciousness is the indispensable quality of the psychic. If his respect for the utterances of the philosophers is still great enough, he may perhaps assume that he and they do not deal with the same thing, and do not pursue the same science. For a single intelligent observation of the psychic life of a neurotic, a single analysis of a dream, must force upon him the unshakable conviction that the most complicated and the most accurate operations of thought, to which the name of psychic occurrences can surely not be refused, may take place without arousing consciousness. 2. The physician, it is true, does not learn of these unconscious processes until they have produced an effect on consciousness which admits of communication or observation. But this effect on consciousness may show a psychic character which differs completely from the unconscious process, so that internal perception cannot possibly recognize in the first a substitute for the second. The physician must reserve himself the right to penetrate, by a process of deduction, from the effect on consciousness to the unconscious psychic process. He learns in this way that the effect on consciousness is only a remote psychic product of the unconscious process, and that the latter has not become conscious as such, and has, moreover, existed and operated without in any way betraying itself to consciousness. It is a truth which cannot be sufficiently emphasized that the concepts of consciousness and of the psyche are not co-extensive. Page 306. A return from the overestimation of the property of consciousness is the indispensable preliminary to any genuine insight into the course of psychic events. As Lipps has said, the unconscious must be accepted as the general basis of the psychic life. The unconscious is the largest circle, which includes the smaller circle of the conscious. Everything conscious has a preliminary unconscious stage, whereas the unconscious can stop at this stage and yet claim to be considered a full psychic function. The unconscious is the true psychic reality. In its inner nature, it is just as much unknown to us as the reality of the external world, and it is just as imperfectly communicated to us by the data of consciousness, as is the external world by the reports of our sense organs. We get rid of a series of dream problems which have claimed much attention from earlier writers on the subject when the old antithesis between conscious life and dream life is discarded, and the unconscious psychic assigned to its proper place. Thus, many of the achievements which are a matter for wonder in a dream are now no longer to be attributed to dreaming, but to unconscious thinking, which is active also during the day. If the dream seems to make play with a symbolical representation of the body, as Schirner has said, we know that this is the work of certain unconscious fantasies, which are probably under the sway of sexual impulses and find expression not only in dreams, but also in hysterical phobias and other symptoms. If the dream continues and completes mental work begun during the day, and even brings valuable new ideas to light, we have only to strip off the dream disguise from this as the contribution of the dream work and a mark of the assistance of dark powers in the depths of the psyche, that is, the devil in Tartini's Sonata Dream. The intellectual achievement as such belongs to the same psychic forces as are responsible for all such achievements during the day. We are probably much too inclined to overestimate the conscious character even of intellectual and artistic production. From the reports of certain writers who have been highly productive, such as Goethe and Helmholtz, we learn rather that the most essential and original part of their creations came to them in the form of inspirations, and offered itself to their awareness in an almost completed state. In other cases, where there is a concerted effort to all the psychic forces, there is nothing strange in the fact that conscious activity too lends its aid, but it is the much abused privilege of conscious activity to hide from us all other activities wherever it participates. It hardly seems worth while to take up the historical significance of dreams as a separate theme. Where, for instance, a leader has been impelled by a dream to engage in a bold undertaking, the success of which has had the effect of changing history, a new problem arises only so long as a dream is regarded as a mysterious power and contrasted with other more familiar psychic forces. The problem disappears as soon as we regard the dream as a form of expression for impulses to which a resistance was attached during the day, whilst at night they were able to draw reinforcement from the deep-lying sources of excitation. But the great respect with which the ancient peoples regarded dreams is based on a just piece of psychological divination. It is a homage paid to the unsubdued and indestructible element in the human soul, to the demonic power which furnishes the dream wish, and which we have found again in our unconscious. Reference: The Dream, Sartoros of Alexander the Great at the Siege of Tyre. It is not without purpose that I use the expression in our unconscious, for what we so call does not coincide with the unconscious of the philosophers, nor with the unconscious of Lipps. As they use the term, it merely means the opposite of the conscious. That there exist not only conscious but also unconscious psychic processes is the opinion at issue, which is so hotly contested and so energetically defended. Lipps enunciates the more comprehensive doctrine that everything psychic exists as unconscious, but that some of it may exist also as conscious. But it is not to prove this doctrine that we have adduced the phenomena of dreams and hysterical symptom formation. The observation of normal life alone suffices to establish its correctness beyond a doubt. The novel fact that we have learned from the analysis of psychopathological formations, and indeed from the first member of the group from dreams, is that the unconscious and hence all that is psychic occurs as a function of two separate systems, and that as such it occurs even in normal psychic life. There are consequently two kinds of unconscious, which have not as yet been distinguished by psychologists. Both are unconscious in the psychological sense, but in our sense the first, which we call UCs, is likewise incapable of consciousness, whereas the second we call PCs because its excitations, after the observance of certain rules, are capable of reaching consciousness, perhaps not before they have again undergone censorship, but nevertheless regardless of the UC system. The fact that in order to attain consciousness, the excitations must pass through an unalterable series, a succession of instances as is betrayed by the changes produced in them by the censorship, has enabled us to describe them by analogy in spatial terms. We describe the relations of the two systems to each other and to consciousness by saying that the system PCs is like a screen between the system UCs and consciousness. The system PCs not only bars access to consciousness, but also controls the access to voluntary motility, and has control of the emission of a mobile cathectic energy, a portion of which is familiar to us as attention. We must also steer clear of the distinction between the superconscious and the subconscious, which has found such favor in the more recent literature on the psychoneuroses, for just such a distinction seems to emphasize the equivalence of what is psychic and what is conscious. What role is now left in our representation of things to the phenomenon of consciousness, once so all-powerful and overshadowing all else? None other than that of a sense organ for the perception of psychic qualities. According to the fundamental idea of our schematic attempt, we can regard conscious perception only as the function proper to a special system for which the abbreviated designation sees commends itself. This system we conceive to be similar in its mechanical characteristics to the perception system P, and hence excitable by qualities, and incapable of retaining the trace of changes, that is, devoid of memory. The psychic apparatus, which, with the sense organ of the P systems, is turned to the outer world, is itself the outer world for the sense organ of C's, whose teleological justification depends on this relationship. We are here once more confronted with the principle of the succession of instances which seems to dominate the structure of the apparatus. The material of excitation flows to the sense organ C's from two sides. First, from the P system, whose excitation, qualitatively conditioned, probably undergoes a new elaboration until it attains conscious perception, and secondly, from the interior of the apparatus itself, whose quantitative processes are perceived as a qualitative series of pleasures and pains, once they have reached consciousness after undergoing certain changes. The philosophers who became aware that accurate and highly complicated thought structures are possible, even without the cooperation of consciousness, thus found it difficult to ascribe any function to consciousness. It appeared to them a superfluous mirroring of the completed psychic process. The analogy of our C's system with the perception systems relieves us of this embarrassment. We see that perception through our sense organs results in directing an attention cathexis to the paths along which the incoming sensory excitation diffuses itself. The qualitative excitation of the P system serves the mobile quantity in the psychic apparatus as a regulator of its discharge. We may claim the same function for the overlying sense organ of the C system. By perceiving new qualities, it furnishes a new contribution for the guidance and suitable distribution of the mobile cathexis quantities. By means of perceptions of pleasure and pain, it influences the course of the cathexes with the psychic apparatus, which otherwise operates unconsciously, and by the displacement of qualities. It is probable that the pain principle first of all regulates the displacements of cathexis automatically, but it is quite possible that consciousness contributes a second and more subtle regulation of these qualities, which may even oppose the first, and perfect the functional capacity of the apparatus by placing it in a position contrary to its original design, subjecting even that which induces pain to cathexis and to elaboration. We learn from neuropsychology that an important part in the functional activity of the apparatus is ascribed to these regulations by the qualitative excitations of the sense organs. The automatic rule of the primary pain principle, together with the limitation of functional capacity bound up with it, is broken by the sensory regulations, which are themselves again automatisms. We find that repression, which, though originally expedient, nevertheless finally brings about a harmful lack of inhibition and of psychic control, overtakes memories much more easily than it does perceptions, because in the former there is no additional cathexis from the excitation of the psychic sense organs. Whilst an idea which is to be warded off may fail to become conscious because it has succumbed to repression, it may on other occasions come to be repressed simply because it has been withdrawn from conscious perception on other grounds. These are clues which we make use of in therapy in order to undo accomplished repressions. The value of the hypercathexis which is produced by the regulating influence of the C's sense organs of the mobile quantity is demonstrated in a teleological context by nothing more clearly than by the creation of a new series of qualities, and consequently a new regulation, which constitutes the prerogative of man over animals. For the mental processes are in themselves unqualitative, except for the excitations of pleasure and pain which accompany them, which, as we know, must be kept within limits as possible disturbers of thought. In order to endow them with quality, they are associated in man with verbal memories, the qualitative residues of which suffice to draw upon them the attention of consciousness, which in turn endows thought with a new mobile cathexis. It is only on a dissection of hysterical mental processes that the manifold nature of the problems of consciousness become apparent. One then receives the impression that the transition from the preconscious to the conscious cathexis is associated with a censorship similar to that between UCs and PCs. This censorship too begins to act only when a certain quantitative limit is reached, so that thought formations which are not very intense escape it. All possible cases of detention from consciousness and of penetration into consciousness under certain restrictions are included within the range of psychoneurotic phenomena. All point to the intimate and twofold connection between the censorship and consciousness. I shall conclude these psychological considerations with a record of two such occurrences. On the occasion of a consultation a few years ago, the patient was an intelligent-looking girl with a simple, unaffected manner. She was strangely attired, for whereas a woman's dress is usually carefully thought out to the last pleat, one of her stockings was hanging down and two of the buttons of her blouse were undone. She complained of pains in one of her legs and exposed her calf without being asked to do so. Her chief complaint, however, was as follows. She had a feeling in her body as though something was sticking into it, which moved to and fro and shook her through and through. This sometimes seemed to make her whole body stiff. On hearing this, my colleague in consultation looked at me. The trouble was quite obvious to him. To both of us it seemed peculiar that this suggested nothing to the patient's mother, though she herself must repeatedly have been in the situation described by her child. As for the girl, she had no idea of the import of her words, or she would never have allowed them to pass her lips. Here the censorship had been hoodwinked so successfully that under the mask of an innocent complaint, a fantasy was admitted to consciousness which otherwise would have remained in the preconscious. Another example. I began the psychoanalytic treatment of a boy 14 who was suffering from tic convulsive, hysterical vomiting, headache, etc., by assuring him that after closing his eyes he would see pictures or that ideas would occur to him which he was to communicate to me. He replied by describing pictures. The last impression he had received before coming to me was revived visually in his memory. He had been playing a game of checkers with his uncle, and now he saw the checkerboard before him. He commented on various positions that were favorable or unfavorable, or moves that were not safe to make. He then saw a dagger lying on the checkerboard, an object belonging to his father, but which his fantasy laid on the checkerboard. Then a sickle was lying on the board, a scythe was added, and finally he saw the image of an old peasant mowing the grass in front of his father's house, far away. A few days later I discovered the meaning of this series of pictures. Disagreeable family circumstances had made the boy excited and nervous. Here was a case of a harsh, irascible father, who had lived unhappily with the boy's mother, and whose educational methods consisted of threats. He had divorced his gentle and delicate wife, and remarried. One day he brought home a young woman as the boy's new mother. The illness of the 14-year-old boy developed a few days later. It was a suppressed rage against his father that had combined these images into intelligible allusions. The material was furnished by a mythological reminiscence. The sickle was that with which Zeus castrated his father. The scythe and the image of the peasant represented Kronos, the violent old man who devours his children, and upon whom Zeus wreaks his vengeance in so unfilial a manner. The father's marriage gave the boy an opportunity of returning the reproaches and threats which the child had once heard his father utter because he played with his genitals, the draught board, the prohibited moves, the dagger with which one could kill. We have here long impressed memories and their unconscious derivatives which, under the guise of meaningless pictures, have slipped into consciousness by the devious paths opened to them. If I were asked what is the theoretical value of the study of dreams, I should reply that it lies in the additions to psychological knowledge and the beginnings of an understanding of the neuroses which we thereby obtain. Who can foresee the importance a thorough knowledge of the structure and function of the psychic apparatus may attain, when even our present state of knowledge permits of successful therapeutic intervention in the curable forms of psychoneuroses? But it may be asked, what of the practical value of this study in regard to a knowledge of the psyche and discovery of the hidden peculiarities of individual character? Have not the unconscious impulses revealed by dreams the value of real forces in the psychic life? Is the ethical significance of the suppressed wishes to be lightly disregarded, since, just as they now create dreams, they may some day create other things? I do not feel justified in answering these questions. I have not followed up this aspect of the problem of dreams. In any case, however, I believe that the Roman emperor was in the wrong in ordering one of his subjects to be executed because the latter had dreamt that he had killed the emperor. He should first of all have endeavored to discover the significance of the man's dreams. Most probably it was not what it seemed to be. And even if a dream of a different content had actually had this treasonable meaning, it would still have been well to recall the words of Plato, that the virtuous man contents himself with dreaming of that which the wicked man does in actual life. I am therefore of the opinion that dreams should be acquitted of evil. Whether any reality is to be attributed to the unconscious wishes, I cannot say. Reality must, of course, be denied to all transitory and intermediate thoughts. If we had before us the unconscious wishes brought to their final and truest expression, we should still do well to remember that psychic reality is a special form of existence which must not be confounded with material reality. It seems therefore unnecessary that people should refuse to accept the responsibility for the immorality of their dreams. With an appreciation of the mode of functioning of the psychic apparatus and an insight into the relations between the conscious and unconscious, all that is ethically offensive in our dream life and the life of fantasy for the most part disappears. What a dream has told us of our relations to the present reality, we will then seek also in our consciousness, and we must not be surprised if we discover that the monster we saw under the magnifying glass of the analysis is a little tiny infusorian, H. Sachs. For all practical purposes in judging human character, a man's actions and conscious expression of thought are in most cases sufficient. Actions, above all, deserve to be placed in the front rank, for many impulses which penetrate into consciousness are neutralized by real forces in the psychic life before they find issue in action. Indeed, the reason why they frequently do not encounter any psychic obstacle on their path is because the unconscious is certain of their meeting with resistances later. In any case, it is highly instructive to learn something of the intensively tilled soil from which our virtues proudly emerge. For the complexity of human character, dynamically moved in all directions, very rarely accommodates itself to the arbitrament of a simple alternative, as our antiquated moral philosophy would have it. And what of the value of dreams in regard to our knowledge of the future? That, of course, is quite out of the question. One would like to substitute the words in regard to our knowledge of the past, for in every sense a dream has its origin in the past. The ancient belief that dreams reveal the future is not indeed entirely devoid of the truth. By representing a wish as fulfilled, the dream certainly leads us into the future, but this future, which the dreamer accepts as his present, has been shaped in the likeness of the past by the indestructible wish. End of section 46. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto, Birmingham, Alabama. End of The Interpretation of Dreams by Sigmund Freud, translated by A. Brill.